Okay, and so I want to be mindful of folks' time today. So let's go ahead and get this show on the road. So, hi everyone. My name is Alex Macmadu, and I'm an assistant professor of epidemiology at the Brown School of Public Health. I will be moderating today's discussion with historian Max Felker-Kantor, who's the author of Dare to Say No: Policing and the War on Drugs in Schools. So Dr. Felker-Kantor is an associate professor of history at Ball State University. His research explores policing, race, politics, and cities since World War II. And his first book, Policing Los Angeles, Race, Resistance, and the Rise of the LAPD, explores policing and anti-police activism in LA from the Watts Uprising to the 1992 LA Rebellion. His second book, Dare to Say No: Policing and the War on Drugs in Schools, is a history of the DARE program. It was published just earlier this year, and it will be the subject of his talk today and of today's discussion. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Felker-Kantor. He has prepared a presentation for us that should last about 30 minutes or so. And then we have reserved time at the end at the end of the session for questions and for discussion. So thank you again, Dr. Felker-Kantor, so much for joining us today, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex, so much for that introduction. I'll start sharing my screen. And, thank you to Abdullah as well for inviting me here to talk about this new book that just came out about a month ago on the history of the DARE program, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, as well as for all of you who are here. I know during a really busy time in terms of the end of the semester, a lot of things going on in the world with policing and a whole range of things that I acknowledge that are going on. And thank you for taking the time to come listen to me talk about this. And obviously, we'll be talking a lot about police and schools today, which is part of the DARE program and can help us think through, I think, some of the ways that police and education kind of intersect in a way that many people probably have on their minds right now. So just kind of thinking about that in terms of campus protests and the way those have been policed. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the DARE program and my book, the Dare to Say No: Policing and the War on Drugs in Schools. This book traces the history of the DARE program from its origins through roughly the present. And I'll talk kind of give an overview of it, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the elements of prevention and the curriculum and things like that and what DARE aimed to do. And then we'll look forward to our discussion at the end. And so the DARE program, in the fall of 1983, 10 uniformed police officers enter fifth grade classrooms across Los Angeles. And their presence, as I suggest in this book, was for the LAPD an admission of failure. Militarized drug raids, mass sweeps, specialized units, task forces, undercover operations had long been the tactics of choice of people like this, who's on the screen here is Daryl Gates, the chief of police of the LAPD. But those tactics to prevent drugs from reaching America's children had largely failed by 1983. And Daryl Gates describes in the mid-1980s that the police had effectively been unable to stop the supply of drugs to the city streets and to school children. And as he said at one point, quote, "Efforts by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies have been unable to consistently interrupt the ever-increasing flow of illicit drugs. The demand for these drugs, supported in part by public apathy and casual acceptance of drug abuse, has increased." And so Gates goes on from there to say something had to change. And what he envisioned was a program that would turn children themselves or students into the frontline soldiers of this war on drugs. And it would do so in large part by turning the police into teachers. So children in the minds of the police needed to be armed to resist drugs as a new form of prevention, and that police, not classroom teachers or public health experts or others, were the ones who could best ensure students would be able to resist drugs if they were offered them. And so this is this kind of opening moment of the DARE program in 1983 in Los Angeles. It starts as a small program, but then expands nationwide. And the thing that I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about today is DARE's expansion from this kind of pilot program in Los Angeles to then one that goes nationwide. By the time the DARE became a kind of household name, by the late 80s into the early 1990s, DARE was the largest and most visible drug prevention program in the United States. Police officers at its height taught DARE to largely fifth grade and sixth grade students in more than 75% of American school districts, public schools, as well as dozens of countries around the world. And you can kind of see this DARE celebration on the photograph here from 1988, in which kids are in Los Angeles are holding up all the states where DARE had become a part of life for many school children. DARE reached roughly 50 million students globally by the end of 1990s. But as I suggest in this larger book, and the thing that the kind of paradox of DARE is that as it became popular as a prevention measure, it also embodied these kind of paradoxes in terms of it originated in police failure and meant to be an alternative form of drug prevention, but relied on cops as instructors. It hoped to humanize the police in many ways, while also reinforcing a law and order and zero tolerance message. DARE administrators hoped that a calculated public relations campaign enlisting athletes and celebrities alongside the presence of DARE officers would facilitate trust and de-glamorize drugs among the nation's youth. And so what it starts to do, along with these paradoxes, what I'll kind of suggest here as one of the kind of pieces of the book, is that what it started to do is reframe problems that we might see as problems of public health or problems of education or social problems, kind of rooted in social and economic inequalities, the kind of larger structures of that was facilitating and developing in cities that led to the war, sort of drug use, drug dealing, drug trafficking, that while those larger structures were entirely ignored. And that what DARE started to do here is reframe these problems as police problems, as problems to be solved by law and order, by zero tolerance, and that police officers were the ones to solve them, not other experts, whether those be prevention experts, public health experts, or just regular classroom teachers. And so I suggest that this relying on police officers enabled DARE to then transform schools, and in vice versa, that it transformed policing in a larger sense. And it's this framing I use a kind of in the book, a kind of term of a school police nexus that comes out of the DARE program to explain how there was a reciprocal and cooperative relationship between schools and police under the guise of prevention. And so it used these police officers to co-opt, in many cases, the educative purpose of schools to advance policing by another means. So nominally, it's about prevention and education, but it really then advances policing by other kind of strategies, by using this educational strategy. So it blurred the line between the state's social welfare functions and its social control functions, right? That these, in many ways, often treated separately, prevention on the one hand or enforcement on the other. DARE brings those things together and normalize the idea that the police were the people to solve all of these sorts of problems, which, as many people may be thinking, is what we see as we continue into the 21st century, where the police are called on to solve all sorts of social, public health, and other types of problems that we normally wouldn't think that the police should solve. And I would suggest that DARE is one key building block of that move. especially when it comes to police and schools. And in many cases, DARE also comes at a moment when the LAPD was waging a violent and racist drug war on city streets. This war on drugs is happening across the country, but in the context of DARE's origins, is that DARE is in many ways counteracting the very drug war that the LAPD was waging on the city's streets. And here the image is one of an LAPD battering ram. You can't really see it. This tank-like vehicle had a 14-foot battering ram on the front of it that they would use, the police would use to knock into supposed drug dens, drug dealing houses in South Central Los Angeles, predominantly Black, as well as Latinx neighborhoods. But it was this type of vigorous and violent war on drugs that was occurring just at the same time that then DARE becomes this kind of friendly face as an alternative to say there's, on the one hand, we're going to address drugs and prevent drugs by trying to reduce the supply of drugs, by arresting dealers, arresting people who are on the streets using, and then DARE, on the other hand, is counteracting that militarized image by the friendly police officer you see here. And so DARE framed as an alternative, and it's aimed to counteract this aggressive image and to reposition the police as a preventive and kind of preventive side of the war on drugs, as well as mentors for kids. And you can see that in this kind of friendly image that we get here of the DARE officer in a school classroom. And DARE, the people in charge of DARE are very much aware of this, though, because they also make the argument that it's the very, quote, expertise of police officers that they get on the streets from waging that war on drugs. It's that very expertise that enables them to be the ones best able to teach prevention to kids. And as one DARE America kind of quote from a report says, quote, "The police officers assigned to DARE have come straight from the streets. Their years of direct experience with the ruined lives and street crimes caused by substance abuse gives them unmatched credibility." And there's a whole argument here that they said that classroom teachers were ill-equipped to tell kids about drugs and the dangers of drugs, that they needed police to take over that role in schools. And there's also kind of a whole piece here about how somehow kids, fifth graders, were so savvy about drugs and drug use that their classroom teachers would have been kind of out of their depth to be able to talk about drugs or how to kind of avoid them. And so so it's this very logic of, even as it's counteracting the drug war, DARE is relying on this kind of punitive side of the drug war to make the case for why police officers were needed. And what we start to see then is that it actually starts from a kind of it's not entirely an alternative. And so what I suggest is that DARE as a prevention side, a kind of soft side of the war on drugs, actually complemented the punitive war on drugs on city streets, that they actually worked hand in hand. Even as DARE tried to frame them as separate, they actually worked together. And we see that in some of DARE's origins here. And so in many cases, the LAPD started in the mid-1970s to think about, how do you deal with the supply of drugs, or a supply side solution? And the strategy to deal with supply was often one of arrest. It was one of incarceration. It was one of trying to prevent drugs from reaching city streets to begin with. And in 1974, the LAPD started a program called the School Buy Program. And that was an undercover program in which, and these are two officers that from the 1980s, this is from 1986, the image, when officers would be put in local high schools to try to find out and arrest and catch drug dealers in schools. And these were two of them at this press conference with Daryl Gates, who was the LAPD. In 1986, they found 200 students dealing drugs, mostly marijuana, during a kind of 13-week program when they were intensifying this enforcement. They made officers, these undercover officers in high schools, made 393 purchases of drugs, including cocaine and LSD. And they were kind of then in this kind of press conference. And this was the LAPD's strategy for over nearly a decade before Daryl Gates, as I suggested kind of at the beginning, said, this supply side isn't working. We've actually failed. And what he then goes to do is that even as this school buy program was continuing to arrest kids, to confiscate drugs, Daryl Gates and other kind of juvenile justice and other kind of youth policing experts in the LAPD were saying, we've arrested all these people. We've confiscated drugs. But by the early 1980s, youth drug use has not gone down. It's actually gone up, even in the face of these efforts to continue to address the supply side of drugs. And what they start to do then is say, we need to deal with the demand for drugs. We need an alternative solution, one that reduces demand by users. And in this case, users by kids, meaning students. And this is a school safety. This is a kind of magazine that Daryl Gates was writing about the DARE program 3 years after it began. But what he started to say in the early 1980s was, we've got to now deal with the demand side and the supply side of the war on drugs. We've got to deal with the users. And so what they started to do was have a shift in targets. And as Daryl Gates said, this kind of logic was, quote, it became obvious to the department that the conduct of the war locally called for a new approach, one aimed at a new generation of potential users, in the sound belief that once the market for controlled substances diminishes, so would their availability. Demand governs supply. So they're using this logic now that we have to deal with demand side rather than supply side of the war on drugs, and that it was this new generation, the youth, young kids, before they'd even possibly experimented with drugs, who needed to be addressed because they were the future potential users. And so what Daryl Gates did was go to the Los Angeles Unified School District in the spring, January of 1983, to say, we failed, but we need to deal with the demand and we need to start to address this problem. And he was at the school board meetings, and eventually what they worked out is a partnership to deal with this new prevention side of the drug war. And they were like, we will come up with a new type of program to address this problem, to focus on demand, to shift targets from sellers to users. And Daryl Gates partners with the LAUSD, a woman by the name of Dr. Ruth Rich in particular, one of their kind of health specialists and curriculum specialists. And they start to plan and to try to figure out, what sort of program can we develop? And as they're developing that program, they actually, and this is just a journal article from a little later, the LAUSD had already been testing an experimental early intervention program called Project SMART, which was, the acronym was for Self-Management and Resistance Training. And it was part of a new type of prevention programming, of social influence approaches to prevention programming, which tried to help students develop social skills and resistance training. So how to say no. And Project SMART was developed by researchers affiliated with the Health Behavior Research Institute at the University of Southern California. And some of these people included, the lead of this was a man named Dr. Andy Johnson. One of the other people was Bill Hansen, who continues to work in the prevention space. And he was the first author here. You see them at the top. As well as a doctoral candidate named Luann Rohrbach, who was kind of helped helped on this program as well. I spoke to all of them as part of the research for this book. So after meeting with the LAUSD, Gates approaches the Project SMART researchers and offered services of police officers to deliver the Project SMART curriculum. And the thing that's interesting is that the USC researchers, according to at least Andy Johnson, were wary of police officers using and bearing that anti-drug lesson plans, and due in part to the concern that the LAPD's us versus them attitude in various communities, especially communities of color. And they said, we don't want to partner with you. But Gates pushed ahead anyway. And in part, what they started to do is they went forward anyway, with he and Ruth Rich and a number of other people, to develop this prototype program in the summer of 1983. They developed a blueprint for this substance abuse education for Los Angeles City schools. Now, they did have some permission from the SMART researchers to adopt various elements of the Project SMART curriculum. But what ended up happening was that Ruth Rich and others included part of the SMART curriculum that the SMART researchers had already evaluated and found to not work. And this was a, quote, affective education, promoting things like self-esteem and decision-making, not the resistance training side, that they found led to actually increased drug use and had removed it from SMART already. But DARE, for whatever reason, this new program combined elements of the resistance training model and this ineffective affective education component. And that's the part that many people may remember if you went through DARE, which is about self-esteem, decision-making, and all of that. And they combine to become DARE. So the interesting thing for the prevention science of all of this and the prevention programming is that the original curriculum, at least according to the Project SMART researchers, said they were adopting a part that was already known to be ineffective. And that will come back around when I get to the end of the talk in a little bit. So this substance abuse education for Los Angeles City schools becomes Project DARE in the fall of 1983, when the pilot program that I began with sent officers into local elementary schools to deliver this new DARE programming. And this DARE curriculum, as it developed, and I've just got an image of it here from a little bit later in the 1980s, initially consisted of 15 lessons presented every other week to fifth grade students. It was later expanded to 17 lessons, and they lasted about 45 to 60 minutes. They eventually become weekly, a 17-week kind of curriculum that focused on building things. And you can see in the kind of image here, things like self-esteem, this idea of positive self-image, the also other kind of ways to say no, using things like saying no thanks, giving a reason, the broken record, walking away, changing the subject, right? The cold shoulder. All of these were kind of strategies of how, just turn your back on drug dealers. And you can see here building self-esteem, assertiveness, managing stress, all of these kind of affective elements, right? And then, of course, here's the other eight or so media influences, decision-making, alternatives, so on, and then there's a gang component that develops later. And so all of this was this kind of curriculum that came out of that partnership. And this is a more expanded, that was this 17-week curriculum that if anyone who's on this call or on this kind of a webinar has done DARE, you might remember many of these, right, pieces of DARE. And so they developed this curriculum. And the key is, the thing that made it fundamentally different was that it would be delivered by police officers. That was the kind of innovation that Daryl Gates and the LAPD and others had in mind, was that the police officers would be at the center of this program. that they would take on a new role. And of course, this is an officer by the name of Greg Bowles. He was kind of early on the one that was in a lot of the kind of marketing and promotional material. And this is him delivering the DARE program, a DARE lesson at Rosewood Ave School in Los Angeles, with Nancy Reagan visiting. She came to visit the DARE classrooms because eventually the Reagan administration and the George H.W. Bush administration really start to support the program, but it starts locally. And so this whole thing revolves around the DARE officer. And as you can see, they would teach in uniform, and they were supposed to be unarmed, and they were not supposed to act as an enforcement arm for the drug war. They were supposed to be teachers. And there's all sorts of issues that we could raise in Q&A about that. I'm happy to talk a lot more, because what ends up happening is that there's this blurriness in which DARE officers start to get trusted by kids. They'll often then report things that they heard about drug use or other things to other officers who would then enforce those enforce those drug laws or other things in schools. This leads to kids turning in their own parents for drug use and a whole range of things as they took this lesson, right, to kind of quote, help your friends, right, by telling if you see something or somebody using drugs. And so the police officer is at the very center of this entire thing, this entire program. They would lead kids through this workbook that was developed. And this is one of the earliest workbooks that I was able to actually find from the early, probably 83, 84, roughly, that the kids would have worksheets, lessons that they would work through, right, through these different lessons. Advice for the DARE, advice for kids. There was a DARE word list, a series of activities that the kids would complete over the course of the program. You can see here at the bottom that this is this partnership between the schools and the police officers. And so that is the kind of key piece that we start to see. And the kind of friendly police image on this about dare to say no, right? Dare to have that just say no message. So of course, as many of you may be thinking, the larger context of this by the mid-1980s is Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. They're different programs, but they're adopting the same type of zero tolerance, just say no to drugs idea, right? Which misses a whole range of other kind of structural and socioeconomic factors that might lead kids, right, to potentially experimenting with drugs. And so what also happens, which starts to lead to this blurriness, is that police officers, those DARE officers, the Officer Bowles and others, would not only stay on school grounds for the lessons, they would actually often stay at schools for the duration of the school day, or they would give extra assemblies to young kids as going down to kindergarten and first grade. They would participate in extracurricular activities with kids. And so this is an example of, you can see on the right in the image, DARE Track Club, is that police officers then also became things like forming a DARE, coaching a DARE track club, coaching the football team, participating in holiday activities, such as in one case, one played Santa Claus and Rudolph, right? To kind of reframe the image that these aren't the roles which young people often see law enforcement officers. And so it was this type of activity, and this is this end of this DARE race, this DARE run against drugs in 1985, that was meant to, what I argue, this was the real part of DARE. It was sold as a prevention program, but the real part of it was, let's try to address this image of the police and humanize the police for kids. And they did that through these sorts of activities like this DARE Track Club. And then the other ones, just because I couldn't kind of resist, is they also had this kind of humanizing element. And this was a band called Hot Pursuit, which was out of Columbus, Ohio, that the band became a kind of, quote, musical complement to the local DARE program. One band member described their work, right, saying that this was a way for kids to see them and see that they're human, that they can talk to them. And I spoke to one person who actually, their first their first concert, excuse me, as a kid growing up in Columbus, Ohio, was when the DARE officers, or excuse me, the school took them to see Hot Pursuit as a band. And you can see in the bottom they just say no to drugs. And you can see that actually the guitars in that image are shaped like assault rifles. And so this kind of image of law and order, this image of policing continues to get reinforced, even though it's nominally about this kind of prevention programming. And so this is another way that, and then you get these other kind of marketing materials as well, where police start dressing up or kind of decorating cars with DARE imagery. You get McGruff the crime dog there as well, right? These kind of community relations. DARE is really about all of this other work. The prevention side of it really actually takes a back seat to this broader marketing program that they're involved with. And this magazine, of course, the thing that's interesting is it comes out of Law and Order, which is a police magazine. And so this is this humanizing element of the DARE program. And it becomes really popular. As I said before, starts to be adopted in 75% of school districts. It's backed by politicians like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And Congress members from around the country start to support the program as well, because they see prevention programming as a positive element, as something that they're to show that they're doing something positive on the drug war. And what you start to see is that what happens is DARE then starts to become a key part of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act of 1986 and its amendments, which gets amended in a series of years, 88, 89, and then 90. And what I've highlighted for you here is that you get in this amendment in 1990, drug abuse resistance and education and replication of successful drug education programs is part of that amendment and part of the legislation, in which DARE itself, the name, Drug Abuse Resistant Education Program, is actually like literally in the legislation. So DARE is named in here as a model drug prevention program. And so what you start to see, and I'll just kind of advance it here. This is the next page. You can see at the top that it's this drug abuse resistance education that met the requirements of paragraph 2. And in paragraph, they talk all about what to get federal funding, what types of programs you have to have. And it has things like, you have to have instruction in following areas about drug use, about resistance, about assertiveness, media influences, all of this is self-esteem, right? All of that sort of work. And the other piece that I'll highlight just there again is that it's also part of that paragraph is, quote, classroom instruction by uniformed law enforcement officials. So DARE is not only named, but the idea that prevention was best taken on by police officers gets written into the legislation, right? And so that's where you then get lots of people adopting the DARE program, because to get federal funding, you have to have this type of model program that starts to get used. So this is just the legislation. But just as DARE is kind of accelerating in this early 90s period, it's backed by the federal government. And this is where I'll kind of conclude in a few minutes. I've got a couple more slides to kind of talk about this, is that people started to wonder, was it actually effective at preventing drug use among kids, among youth? And there was a long history of evaluation and assessment of the program. There were built-in mechanisms in Los Angeles and elsewhere where they directly contracted with the Evaluation Training Institute, or ETI, to conduct yearly evaluations. But in many cases, and those evaluations early on were overwhelmingly favorable. They were all like, DARE's great, it's effective, everyone loves it. Now, they were hired directly by the LAPD, so we could kind of talk about conflicts of interest there. But what starts to happen is by the late 80s and early 90s, you started to get public health researchers, criminologists, and others unaffiliated with DARE turning their attention to evaluate the program. It was receiving lots of taxpayer funding, and researchers wanted to know, is it effective? Initial studies found a lot of support for the program from police and others, but little evidence that DARE helped to reduce drug use. So there's this rising pressure on DARE to figure out, does it actually work? And what you had is some DARE officials, along with some officials from the National Institute of Justice, or NIJ, tried to attempt to confirm that what they believed was DARE's positive impact on kids. And they solicited proposals for a nationwide study of the DARE program. The grant was awarded to a group of researchers at the Research Triangle Institute to conduct this the quote here, to conduct an extensive review of the DARE program and to assess its place within the context of the broad spectrum of school-based drug use prevention efforts. Two of the leading researchers on that was Christopher Ringwald and Susan Ennett. And they did a meta-analysis of all the other studies of DARE. So they weren't doing original research, but they started to do this meta-analysis. And DARE America was the nonprofit that organized DARE, was initially supportive and said, yes, go ahead, let's do this, let's get the word out, because they thought this would be a positive result. So they urged cooperation with this program, with this evaluation effort. Then what happens is an initial presentation of findings happened at this conference in 1993 at UC San Diego called Evaluating School-Linked Prevention Strategies. And so these are the proceedings. Lucky for anyone who's a historian, luckily for me, the proceedings were reproduced. And so we have the record of this conference. And at that conference, and I'll just the next page, the table of contents, you can see, I've highlighted here, an entire section basically of that conference was devoted to the DARE program and prevention strategies in schools. And this is where Susan Ennett and Chris Ringwald presented their initial findings of the DARE study that they had been doing. And what they found effectively was it was popular, it was widespread, that there was something about kids liking police officers, but that it hadn't actually done anything to prevent drug use among kids. So this kind of national study that had been promoted initially by DARE was that they said this doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do in terms of prevention. One of the DARE America people is actually there and says, I'd hate to see that he gets up and he gives kind of comments this is Glenn Levant. He was an LAPD officer who then becomes in charge of DARE. And he says, I would hate this productive program to be disparaged by the mediocrity of the studies that have been the base of evaluation today. So I'd urge as the findings of this panel that somebody fund an appropriate national evaluation. Only then will we know, right, that the DARE program lives up to the anecdotal information of this effectiveness, right? And so there's this moment in the 90s with this national study that leads them to heading off. DARE America becomes really critical of social science and evaluations of the program. They eventually, more and more studies start to come out. There's a big one in like 1995, 96, in which they find that suburban white kids started doing more drugs after DARE. And that really got people worried. And what ends up happening is then DARE eventually says, we'll change. The federal government starts to say you have to have scientifically backed programs to get federal funding. And DARE is not on the initial list that eventually comes out in 2001. So DARE starts to go through this kind of moment of crisis as it loses this kind of cachet. Social science and evaluations start to say it didn't work. It's left off the government list. It starts to undergo a series of revisions, in part with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, in which it then kind of emerges into a series of new DARE curriculums, where they get new reviews. And this is, as this says, it's mixed reviews, but it was more interactive. It was supposed to be more interactive for kids, a lot more role playing, a whole series of other types of education. This one was called Take Charge of Your Life. And that was evaluated by Zili Sloboda at the University of Akron. Eventually, DARE then revises again into something called Keeping It Real, and that's the curriculum that still exists today. But the key is, for my argument in part, is that it's still presented and taught by uniformed law enforcement agents, is that DARE's gone through these curriculum revisions, but it still has the kind of fundamental issue of police are at the center of this entire program. And so it continues to exist. It's gone through these kind of revisions. I'm happy to talk more about that. But the kind of law enforcement zero tolerance idea is still largely central to the program. So thank you for listening to me for 35 or 40 minutes here. I'm happy to answer questions and have a discussion about this book, about some of the things about DARE or anything else that people have interest in. So I'm going to stop sharing and I think we'll open up now.
Ah, amazing. So thank you, Dr. Felker-Kantor, so much for this really fascinating overview of the history of the DARE program. This has been a really excellent presentation. So at this point, we can transition into the Q&A and discussion portion of the hour. So I have a couple of questions about what you presented and about your work, but I can also table some of my questions to make sure that we have ample time for Q&A from the audience. So I'll start us off, and I'll take a moment now to invite members of our audience to please start popping your questions into the chat. And also, before I get carried away, I wanted to be sure to remember to also pop into the chat this link to purchase your book so that folks have that available as well. All right, so at the top of the hour, you mentioned the relevance of this work or themes of this work to the current moment with the police response to pro-Palestinian student protesters on college campuses across the country, including, of course, here at Brown, and I know Ball State as well. And I'm curious if, in your view, the DARE program and programs like it sort of started to open the door to this carceral approach to students in the US.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And I think that that's one of the major arguments that I try to make in the book is that there's not it's not that police had not been in schools or in those sorts of places prior to 1983. There's long histories of youth police kind of interaction programs. There's police athletic leagues in the 30s and 40s. Some of you may be familiar with officer friendly programs that were kind of in the 1960s and 70s. And so there's not it's not like this is the first time. The the LA Unified School District starts a security section in 1948, and that eventually becomes the LAUSD's school police department. So they form their own school police department. But what I suggest is that DARE, because of its kind of sustained nature of having a police officer come in, teach a curriculum, and that it's really about normalizing the police in this role, that it kind of was this opening, it was kind of an opening wedge to where police were kind of became this kind of normal part of school or education, right? To be expected to be there beyond in all sorts of ways and not just as enforcers, right? And obviously DARE was not taught at college campuses, but I think the same sort of process of well, we're going to have police officers here. They're, on college campuses, as often as well, they're not the real police, right? They're here for this other purpose, right? And well, no, they're all still police officers, right? They're uniformed, armed, all those sorts of things with the same sort of mission, right? And the same sort of training. And so I think to your question, that I do think this is this kind of way that we can see the longer trajectory over the last 25, 30 years of the ways that police have been able to kind of come and be normalized as part of this response or part of schools in general. And of course, the thing that's similar too, and then I'll kind of stop because I think it's really important, is that I make the point that even the DARE officers never shed the police side of it or the law and order imagery. It's the same thing now. It's yeah, we'll have police, they'll come on school campuses for nominal protection, but they're still there as police officers, right? Let alone that if we look at UCLA and other places, right, that they kind of just let people attack peaceful protesters, right? And so they're still in that kind of mindset. And I think we see the same thing in some cases with DARE. It's there's the police mission is still there, even if it's being framed as something different.
Thank you so much for that, for that thoughtful response. So we have a question from the audience that I can pull. And so this is from an anonymous attendee, but they're asking, is the DARE program still in a majority of the schools in the
That's
US?
a really good question, which I don't know the full answer. It's not in the majority of schools. It is still around, and it kind of went through. So the longer history of the 21st century DARE program is it kind of had this height in the late mid 90s when the government came out and DARE wasn't on those lists of effective programs. You had all these then school districts say, well, why are we spending our money on a prevention program that hasn't been deemed effective? And so some of the school districts start dropping the program in favor of some of the other types of programs, right? I mean, there's like life skills training. There's all these other types of programs that are still around. There's a Project All Stars, which is one that Bill Hansen, I believe, is still involved with or was the kind of key to. And so so they start to adopt these other types of programs. So it goes through kind of a dip, and then the leadership changes. But then it's kind of reemerged in like the last 5 or 6 years, where it's kind of I see all the time like new schools readopting the DARE program. So I apologize, I don't have a specific number of how many schools it's in currently, but I do know if you can go to their website and then you can see that it's dare.org, or yeah, I think that it's changed between dare.org and dare.com, but I believe it's dare.org, where they kind of promote, here's all the things we're doing. And really what they've done is they've adopted a curriculum called Keeping It Real, which they didn't design, but they said, we're just going to keep the delivery mechanism. So we're going to work with proven programs, but we're going to keep the delivery mechanism because we have a network of officers who know how to teach it, and we can have program fidelity then, right? So it can be reproducible. So it's still there. I get Google alerts every single day about a DARE graduation or like DARE's being readopted in this local school district. So it's still around, but I don't have a number.
Oh, yeah, totally understood. And actually kind of, I guess, related to this question about like where we are currently today.
Mhm.
So much of the research and the work of our research collective, the People, Place, and Health Collective, is focused on harm reduction.
Mhm.
And you mentioned in the book that the Drug Policy Alliance has developed what they call like an accurate, honest, compassionate drug education program. I believe that was called but Safety First,
Mhm.
real drug education for teens. And I'm curious if you think that we could maybe expect to see more widespread adoption or rollout of this kind of harm reduction oriented program for students over the coming years.
Mm.
Kind of like why or why not?
I mean, I would like to. I do think that so I think that is sort of these kind of other programs, harm reduction models, other kind of models that show more a kind of different approach, right, are ones that show a lot of promise. Um, the hope is that they start to get adopted more. Um, I wonder if some of the changing attitudes around, especially like marijuana laws and other things like that, are leading us in a way that people are sort of open to other forms of education as well. But the fear is that the police departments, right, are going to resist that sort of prevention model, right? Which most of you in your collective probably know a lot more than I do about this, in the present, about the kind of challenges of that. But my sense would be, from as a historian, of policing and race and all of that, is that there would be a real opposition from that of like, you're just telling kids they can do drugs, right? Which is not what harm reduction is meant to be doing, right? But I think we've seen, and I think we've seen there was a lot of promise, right? We had like Oregon decriminalization, but we've seen that stuff kind of rolled back, right? And so that's the fear, is like there's, I think, a moment of possibility when we started to see that, but then it kind of moved backwards, which but I think for my purpose, like from one thing that I can say is like I think we'd see a lot of opposition, right, to from both politicians but police, right, to this sort of. Now, the question is, the opioids brings in a whole other thing because it affects people different. It's a different kind of, different than the crack cocaine war on drugs, right? Because of all the race, class kind of connotations. But
Right. So I guess that we can, our best hope perhaps would be for some uh progressive community perhaps to implement it, evaluate it, demonstrate its success, and convince
Right.
other people, let's roll this out. So looking at more questions rolling in from the chat. One of our attendees, Jack Rusley, was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the link between DARE and school resource officers,
Yeah.
SROs.
It's a great question. And what the key is, so like one thing is that DARE officers initially, like in the 80s and 90s, they were explicitly not trained or not certified to be school resource officers. Because the idea is, right, you want these DARE officers as teachers, not part of this kind of other policing mechanism. We'll have them separate. And what we start to see, though, is that post-Columbine, the shooting, you then get a new kind of directive where they start to train all DARE officers as school resource officers as well. And so they're certified as both. So what you start to get over time is this blurring between like, oh, they were just instructors, not explicitly not to do any sort of enforcement. But then over time and then post 9/11 and stuff as well, they start to kind of connect the two. And so they become kind of one and the same in that sense. And so they provide, but to kind of the question as well. So that's the kind of way that they become literally connected. But I think what we can see is that, or the argument I would make again, is that DARE kind of sowed the ground, so to speak, right? So that when people started adopting school resource officers, it was like, well, they're police there, and so what's the harm of having these new types of police officers? Or it's just silly we call them school resource officers, but like that's a whole different story.
Absolutely. So in the book, you talk about how DARE has been the subject of a wide range of kind of parody and critique. I think you use the example of like, people smoking pot in their DARE t-shirts, just feel like they're sticking it to the man. And from what you present today too, we know that DARE and similar programs have been ineffective in preventing drug use. So just to speak to like a personal example, when I was 15 years old, I was part of the West Virginia's RAISE program, which is a statewide anti-tobacco program. I was in statewide commercials, anti-tobacco commercials. And then by 18, I was a full-fledged smoker, nearly a pack a day for like 8 years. All that to say, there's a lot of significant critique. And I'm curious if you could speak a bit to what it means to take the parody of DARE and similar programs seriously as a form of political critique.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we see is like, obviously it can be seen as, oh, it's just a joke and people make fun of it, right? And it's like the stories of like people like, I mean, that the anecdote that's in the introduction about this student who has at the University of Wisconsin, who's like, yeah, I still smoke dope, and my DARE t-shirt to stick it to the man is like inherently a political like statement, right? I'm sticking, kind of to the image of the police officer. But what I think we see is like beyond that, like I had a research assistant find all these ways that DARE, like the things DARE didn't teach me on TikTok, and it was this whole thing of like these threads on TikTok of like DARE didn't teach me this, DARE didn't teach, and like all these and I think what we see in that is that really what kids or whatever generation uses TikTok these days, right, is pointing out is like the ineffectiveness of that type of zero tolerance program, right? That's like they just told us to say no to these things, but they didn't tell us, it's like how do you deal with these things, the harm reduction piece, right? And so I think that's the kind of critique is like it's actually a critique of the kind of way that drug education had operated, especially in the 1990s, right? About this is zero tolerance, just say no. And so those things become ways to kind of critique politically, right? That kind of approach to drug prevention. And so I think that's what we see in a lot of that parody, right? And then there's a whole other wing of parody, which is just use the kind of cultural memory of the DARE program, where it's like celebrities wearing the DARE t-shirt, right? As like fashion statements and things like that. And so, or Serena Williams, right, husband wearing it in the stands of the US Open, right? To kind of troll Maria Sharapova, right? Because it's like, so it becomes this kind of cultural moment as well. But
It's all excellent. Yeah, thank you. And looks like we have another question from the audience from an anonymous attendee, asking if perhaps if you could speak a bit more on the effects of increased police interactions with children through programs that put police in schools.
Yeah, no, I mean, so that's a good question because like, and the evidence is like, some of the evidence from the 90s, right, is always kind of it's like hard to exactly get evidence from kids. Like a lot of the evaluations that were done, some of them did say, yeah, it didn't prevent drug use, but students seem to have an attitude that's a little more positive towards the police, right? In some cases. So they're like, yeah, it actually did work, like, in that sense. Now, when kids got to high school, like some of the studies that followed kids to high school, they're like, yeah, we just made fun of the dare officer because he told us that if we did drugs or like listen to to satanic music that we'd become like drug dealers or something. It's like these. So like the high schoolers later become a little more cynical. But the evaluations, a lot of them do show, yeah, that pro-police messaging, at least for the like fifth and sixth graders, might have kind of changed that relationship, right? Which, as some people say, is like maybe that's not a bad thing per se, right? Depending on where you stand on all of this. However, right, anecdotally, we know that, and this is from largely newspaper coverage in the 90s, is that it did lead that humanizing of the police then led to a number of students ending up turning in parents for drugs. So there's a series of famous cases in the 90s where kids, and the most famous one comes out of Maine, and it's this girl, Crystal Grendel, where she was like approached by her dare officer because she's like, do you do drugs? Do your parents have drugs? She eventually admits it. Then later that, like, in a series of, it's either a day later or kind of in this kind of interaction, the police raid her parents' house, arrest the parents. They hadn't actually planned what to do with her and her sister, so they had to like send them away to like their relative's house. And so in those cases, and later she gives an interview in which like a few years later where she's like, I'll never trust the police again, right? And so there's these kind of tensions there, even as this might have reshaped some of the image of the police for some kids. For others, it led to this kind of ulterior, like other lesson of like, why would I tell them if they told us this is the right thing to do, and then they then end up arresting my parents, right? And so there's kind of a tension there, even as the studies kind of suggest there was this change. And then a kind of third level of this is even more anecdotal, is that people I've spoken with who grew up through this period talk a lot about, like, especially, and this kind of goes to the next question in a way, is like, or the next question from the audience, if we get there, especially in like communities of color in Los Angeles and elsewhere, people are like, they just came in and told us that we were drug dealers and crack babies and that we're going to, be arrested anyway, right? And so those were the anecdotes from people that I, as I was doing the work that I would hear, right? So there's this kind of layered of like, yes, we get these kind of multiple choice evaluations that say, yeah, kids like this, like the police officer a little more, but from then the qualitative kind of anecdotal evidence we get a different kind of a more nuanced view, right? Especially at the individual level.
And so thank you so much for that incredibly thorough and like thoughtful response. And thankfully you were able to, it sounds like, touch on that very last question we had from the audience about how, essentially about how DARE targeted communities of color. So I'd like to just say thank you again to you for joining us today and for all of your time. And many thanks to the audience for your questions and for engaging in this talk with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.